All right, let's get this masters started. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Kelly, founder and CEO of Upwave, the analytics platform for brand advertising, and welcome to our latest Masters of Brand Measurement panel series. We have done this series for over 6 years, both in person and virtual, and we are very happy to continue doing it this year and beyond. And the reason we do this event is to bring together the ad measurement community to learn about timely topics from industry thought leaders like the three joining us today. So it seems that all conversations today in ad measurement end up tying to outcomes one way or the other. So we're going to have the theme today of all roads lead to outcomes. And I'm delighted to be joined by three esteemed panelists. So we hear how various perspectives are thinking about outcomes across the industry: media buyers, media sellers, media measurement partners, and more. And hopefully we'll hear not just about how we are measuring outcomes, but perhaps even to optimize campaigns to those outcomes. And as an administrative note, we will aim to save time for Q&A from the audience towards the end of our conversation. So please put your questions in the Q&A function throughout the conversation, and we will get to them at the end. Now, let's get started. We'll have our panelists give a very quick intro about themselves so you know who you're hearing from today. And I'll turn first to Daniel Slotweiner, SVP of Attention at DoubleVerify.
Hey, Chris, thanks a lot. So I'm Daniel. I'm currently heading up the attention area at DoubleVerify, and I've spent my career thinking a lot about outcomes and measuring ad effectiveness at places like Google and Facebook.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Glad to have you. I know the audience is looking forward to your perspectives today. And next up, Sarah Owens, SVP Analytics at Media Matters Worldwide.
Hi, I'm Sarah. Nice to be here with you, Chris, and Devin and Daniel, and thanks everyone for coming. I lead our analytics team at Media Matters Worldwide. We're a media agency, and my team looks after everything that involves data, from really audience development and audience execution to measurement and beyond. So happy to be.
I know the audience will look forward to hearing about that experience today and how it impacts your view on ad measurement. And Devin Fallon, Senior Director, Media Insights and Analytics from Vizio.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be here. Nice to see my fellow panelists. As Chris said, I lead our Insights and Analytics team on the Vizio ad side of the house, which is our media and ad tech complement to our legacy consumer electronic brand Vizio. So we do everything in our power to help our ads clients maximize the value of their ad spend via planning, targeting, and measurement strategy and analysis.
Great. Thank you, Devin. I know we're looking forward to all of your comments here today. And Devin, you are always the best dressed panelist wherever I see you on stage. So appreciate
Very
that.
kind of you, Chris. Thank you.
So naturally, let's start with definitions so our audience knows what we're actually talking about with all these words we're using around outcomes. So I'll start by asking each of you to define how you and or your clients define outcomes, or at least react to my definition, which is that at Upwave, we think about the whole measurement ecosystem as delivery metrics, audience metrics, and outcome metrics. Delivery metrics relating to how the ad hits the screen of the consumer, thus viewability, attention, fraud, brand safety, clicks, metrics like that. Audience metrics relating to how many and what type of people saw the ad. And then outcome metrics relating to what actually happens outside of the ad. Was there a brand outcome? Was there a behavior outcome? Was there a business outcome? So I'd love to hear any reactions to that. So Daniel, I'll start with you. How do you and your clients think about defining what outcomes even mean?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So for the most part, very aligned with the definition you just outlined. I say when people think about outcomes, there's no question they are thinking about the reaction or the response to an ad exposure. I think it goes all the time to a conversion of some kind. That could be a brand or attitudinal conversion or a click. Hopefully not just a click, but a real purchase. And of course, I think that's always comes in the context of what did it cost me to get that outcome. So those are the things we think about a lot. I'd say the other area is, the word sort of triggers at the moment a lot of angst given the changes in the industry. Like I used to know how to measure outcomes, and maybe I won't be able to do that in the future. So it raises questions like that at the moment and in conversations I'm having. So I think it's an interesting term at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. And Sarah, what's the take from your clients? You have the pleasure of working with a variety of advertisers. When they come to you and demand outcomes on a campaign, what do they mean?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of varies. It varies across the board, but we've worked really hard across our entire client roster to move toward outcomes that matter. And so, and honestly, and so sometimes that is, if you're running a brand campaign, we need to measure attitudinal, so is there lift in awareness, or is it perception of the brand, or whatever the objective of the campaign is. But we always start the conversation very early on. So when we're first, sort of strategizing and planning an advertising campaign, we start measurement planning, and we start with asking the question, not only what is the objective, but what does success look like? And so that really helps guide to get to like a real outcome that matters. So, no one's ever going to say like, oh, success looks like we'll have like 2% conversion, 2% click-through rate. So it really helps guide the conversation. And we really try to align, what kind of business objective are you trying to meet, and have it be very aligned with the objective of the campaign.
Yeah, makes sense. And Devin, what's the view from a company selling media? Do you see any confusion around what an outcome means? I've seen some platforms talk about video completion as an outcome, which I would define as a delivery metric, not any type of conversion, as Daniel mentioned, like an attitudinal conversion or a sale conversion. Did you have any confusion from your clients?
Well, I think Sarah put it well in that it's important to set expectations. And I would offer, I guess, a slight riff on the prompt in that perhaps it's more of just a difference of semantics than confusion. And maybe that in itself is a semantic argument. But I think there is this sense that depending on the sophistication of the client, depending on how close our agency or client team is with the buying, to what the actual like brand strategy team is within in the client, outcomes may look different for each of those teams. So I'd say the definition you gave is generally the one we subscribe to, in that when we're talking about outcomes with a capital O, we're generally talking about those tangible events that happen outside of the media. All that being said, in the right situation for us, being able to drive incremental reach above and beyond a linear TV campaign may be an outcome that an agency or a client cares about. So it, allows for a little more squishiness or flexibility in the definition, I'd say.
I see. So even if it doesn't fit our kind of purest definition of outcome, if it's around an audience metric, it's the goal they're aiming for. So it's what your job at Vizio is to do, to help them reach that goal for the campaign. If the goal were to drive incremental reach, that makes sense. And speaking of this, go ahead.
I was gonna say, that's very interesting, Devin. Is I think in a way there's kind of like categories of outcomes that are important to track and measure during a campaign. One is like to measure success, so that you can be able to say like, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? And that's usually, sometimes it's attitudinal, but at the end of the day, we're always trying to get back to like a sales outcome of some kind. But then there's other outcomes that you want to track to help you steward the campaign. So like to your point of incremental reach, that's important to know, because if you're measuring that across your plan and you see that you have partners that are not adding incremental reach, and it's like duplicative, then that you can make a smart decision to optimize your campaign in flight and then positively impact the eventual outcome. So I think, I hadn't really thought about that way, but that's interesting that there's kind of like, they're both important.
Well, and I would agree, particularly in our situation, one of our core challenges is demonstrating for our clients the incrementality that our platform can provide. But I think there's also this element of expectation management and balancing that you maybe alluded to, Sarah, in that oftentimes if we're trying to drive a new audience that is unexposed or underexposed to historical advertising, that is a noteworthy and ideal goal for us to chase. That might mean that our outcomes actually look lower than historical benchmarks if we're truly reaching a new audience. So it all ties together, right? There's no simplistic formula to make it all work. It's all part of the consideration set.
That's a different value for some outcomes. But I think the other thing we're touching on is, right, there's this notion of a proxy. So it's not a real outcome, but it is, you may be something that if you optimize on, you believe it will improve that ultimate outcome you care about. And that's certainly where we feel attention fits at the moment. Or it's something that you use to optimize a creative in the near term, because down the road that will lead to greater attitudinal improvements. So it is a little bit of a continuum, I guess.
Yeah, this is great. Two follow-ups from some things you mentioned. So Devin, you mentioned about the tangible events that happened because of the media, like that thinking around tangible events. Can you speak to examples of what tangible events maybe are non-standard or industry specific? Do you get asked by, say, pharma companies to drive prescription lift as a tangible event, or automotive companies to drive test drive? So how do you think about kind of any industry specific tangible events that may not be relevant for all advertisers, but you still have to think of how you measure them for someone from a certain vertical?
Yeah, at a start, we generally bifurcate our business between endemic media and entertainment partners. So those advertising partners that would be looking to drive an outcome on our platform, whether it's driving to tune into a linear program, to buy or rent a new movie or show, or to go into an app environment, a streaming environment. So that's a whole host of outcomes that's really low-hanging fruit for us because of all the great signal data we get through our TVs. But then, we kind of cheekily refer to everything else as general market, which is basically every vertical that is not our endemic media and entertainment. And Chris, that's where I think you really hit it, that outcomes will often be specific to individual verticals. So I think a couple of the examples you called out are absolutely ones that we, and I'm sure Daniel and Sarah, have dealt with as well, driving specific sales through whatever means that looks like: offline, in-store, online, driving someone to a specific location. All of those will come into play, site visit, and those are, a couple that immediately come to mind. I would love to hear Daniel and Sarah's take on this. But one of our unique challenges is we know TV in general, before you even get to connected TV or smart TV, TV in general is great for driving that sight, sound, and motion and engagement with the biggest screen in the house, as it always has been for decades. Tying to these outcomes away from the big screen is really important, and we have seen that it works, but often figuring out what the connective tissue is between that media exposure and measuring that event can be a challenge. And that's where I think some of the things Daniel talks about in terms of identifying proxies becomes really compelling, not as a replacement for measuring the true outcomes, but to help us kind of act as, or see guideposts along the way.
Yeah, unfortunately, Dev, that's a great point out. It doesn't get you out of the problem entirely, because you, of course, have to establish that the proxy is a proxy for that value, which is something we are thinking a lot about. And it's kind of, I think it's driven in part by the increase in kind of CTV ads, and to kind of shift away from linear, but also because of all the privacy challenges. Like, there is a real movement in the measurement space back to old forms of measurement, like media mix or match market testing. So kind of what's old is new again. So we're seeing that, like, you use the word connective tissue, I think is a great one. It's sort of like you have to triangulate the value of a signal for a particular outcome, and you have to use a bunch of these methods to do that, depending on the case. If it's, if we're sort of in the pure digital world, it's a little easier, but no one's really living in that world anymore. And so it's interesting to see these exercises coming back as we sit here, actively working on experiments that are, geo-based, and then putting signal into media mix, and then combining those. And you see a bunch of companies springing up that are trying to make this easier to do. So it's, I think you touch on a really good point. It's like these things are sort of being driven together, but at the same time, the complexity is increasing.
Yeah, I was going to ask Sarah to chime in on that too. You mentioned the phrase that caught my attention: how we steward the campaign, which I thought was aligned with Daniel's comments around proxy. So how do you think of that, Sarah? If a client came to you and said, I heard this great webinar from Upwave, I only want to measure outcomes. I want to not look at any delivery metrics or audience metrics, how would you react to that? Would that cut all their diagnostic tools so they wouldn't be able to steward a campaign towards outcomes, or how should they think about metrics that may not be an outcome but would still be important for the campaign?
Yeah, I mean, those metrics are important to our team at Media Matters, and like the planners and the buyers who are executing the campaign. And that's what my team does. So like, I would say, cool, you don't have to ever look at a delivery metric if you don't want to. Certainly our teams would continue to track those, because, you know, we're spending millions of dollars of our clients' money investing in it. And that's a huge responsibility, right? And so we have to do pacing. We have to make sure impressions are delivering and that we're getting what we paid for. And if something starts pacing behind, we have to be on the phone with that partner and, you know, get it on track. Or if viewability is like way below benchmark, we need to be, you know what I mean? Like those are the things, like those are just table stakes, and we need that data, and we need those metrics to basically get what we to execute what we planned and to get what we pay or what we're paying for. So, but that doesn't, you know, and some clients really want to see all that, and some don't. Some are like, just tell me the end of the day, like what's the ROI. So it really, we're happy to like include as much of that or as little of that in our measurement as possible. And we, you know, with tech and dashboards and APIs, like it's pretty easy to flex what you include and what you don't include in regular reporting with clients.
Yeah, got it. That's really interesting. And Daniel, I want to loop back to something you mentioned around, you said you have to establish that a proxy is actually an effective proxy in driving towards the end outcome. And I've heard you mention outside of this panel series that that often means not just doing a one-off research case study, but actually productizing that relationship between metric A and metric B. Can you say more about that? How should marketers think about continually understanding how metric A and metric B relate, not just in a one-off white paper or something like that?
Yeah. I think we talked about it sort of in this shift, or sort of need to shift away from this kind of case study mentality to an always on one, which is something that I've always kind of focused on throughout my career, but quite a bit more recently because of the sort of nature of the attention product that we're building here. And so there's a few aspects to it. I think one is that there isn't, you know, even for attention, I don't think it's really logical to say that, you know, it has a relationship to an outcome and that is permanent and never changes. Right. Because there's, you know, all things like competitive dynamics come into play, or the effectiveness of kind of different channels, or the price of different inventory will change over time, to name a few. And in what we're observing is just really significant proliferation in ad formats and placements, and the sort of changes that publishers are making in real time. So the context in which ads are running is really changing all the time. So even if we're doing a consistent job measuring the same parameters, the same signal over time, how you would interpret that, or how it kind of impacts an outcome measure, is not going to stay constant. And so, you know, when we think about productizing this, it's with those ideas in place. And so there's sort of tenets underlying how we're thinking about it. A core one is, of course, always on. You want to have coverage, as you know, as much of the impressions that you're buying as possible. You want to be able to measure and see, and then you want to build in some kind of periodic relationship to an outcome. Like ideally, that would be always on as well, but that's usually not possible. And so you at least want to have regular correlation exercises, or kind of random check-ins on whether the sort of relationships you've established are still holding, right? We have a tendency to sort of make really strong assumptions that once we've seen something prove out in a case study, then it's always going to be true, which unfortunately isn't usually the case.
Yeah, makes sense. So we shouldn't hard code in somewhere that a 10% change in metric A leads to a 5% change in metric B and operate with that assumption forever. It makes sense to understand that it's constantly changing, as you mentioned. So curious how these conversations shift with advertisers by channel. So sure, Sarah, you have experience with this, talking to omni-channel advertisers, and Devin, you've experienced talking about to linear advertisers about coming to CTV. So Sarah, I'll start with you. How should our audience think about the conversation of outcomes versus audience metrics versus delivery metrics by channel? Does a traditional linear advertiser think about that framework differently than a digital advertiser? Is there any major parts of the conversation that are different if someone is only running linear, only running digital? Do they just look at totally different metrics, or is it usually the same conversation?
Yeah, well, I think, we don't have very many clients that are only running digital or only running, linear or only run, like we try to, this is not a new idea, but we try to reach our audience wherever they are. And,
Yeah.
and campaigns are most successful when audiences are reached across multiple varied touch points. So that's like, it's been proven with data, right? It's better to reach your frequency across multiple platforms. And Devin, you said this earlier, like with TV, sight sound motion is important. Some campaigns, if out of home is going to play a really big role. Digital is always like a workhorse running. So it all works together. And what we really try to do is unify measurement across. So it's like measurement is agnostic of channel. The objective of the campaign is the objective, whether it's being achieved through CTV or display ads or whatever it is. So yeah, we really, maybe the proxies are different because availability of data is very different based on channel. And that's actually why I think our industry has spent so much time reporting on delivery metrics, just because it's so readily available, but it just doesn't get to like the outcomes that we've been talking about. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but I'm kind of grateful for like the disruption we've been experiencing for the last few years in identity and like what it's done to our ability to measure and do MTA and things like that, because it's never been it's never been really like an elegant solution anyway. And I do think, Daniel, you said this a minute ago, it's old is new again. And modeling is like such a more elegant way to measure. And you can do that omni-channel and with AI and things like that. It's just you can do it faster and a little more of an agile way.
I like that it's forcing people to just rethink how advertising works in general.
Totally.
Right? It's like it makes people smarter about I think the whole endeavor because it's more complicated, but definitely not easier.
No.
Yeah. And Devin, if imagine two advertisers came to you for the first time, one from a more linear background, one from a digital background, since CTV offers that best of both worlds. Are they thinking of outcomes very differently? Do they have different vocabulary? Do they have different demands for measurement? Or is it pretty much the same conversation?
No, I'd say in general, it is much more the former, that they tend to be coming from disparate ends of a potential spectrum. We are in an interesting position because our teams and our sellers come into contact with traditional linear buying teams, with fully digital teams, with integrated teams, with sponsorship teams. So we have to be prepared to tailor not just the conversation, but the strategy based on to whom we're speaking and what their outcomes are. And we always want to lead with our experience to make recommendations about how our targeting, our tactics, and our measurement strategies can best capitalize on the business. At the same time, we do have to be responsive to what they're bringing to the table. And Sarah, you mentioned this, the unification of measurement and outcomes across different channels, I think is a really important tool for these disparate teams to find some, I'll say it one more time, some connective tissue or common ground between channels. One of the challenges that historically creates for us is occasionally we'll be working with a partner who does not have a ton of CTV or smart TV experience under their belt and are bringing a set of strategies or preconceived notions based on things they've done on the linear side or on the smartphone side. And that can sometimes put us at a bit of a disadvantage, either because we expect there is a different path to the outcome from the TV or to wherever they're making that converting event, or there is a difference in how effectively we can measure it, how losslessly we can measure it. So Sarah, you mentioned, focusing more on modeling than one-to-one deterministic data in some cases. I don't want to misspeak for you, but generally speaking,
Mhm.
that's an important consideration for us to make sure as we're being compared with some of these other channels, we have set the right expectations and we understand whether we're at parity with the completeness of how our audience is being measured relative to other channels.
Devin, that makes me, I haven't thought about linear TV measurement in a while, because we haven't really like run a lot lately, but I do feel like it's always been super hard to measure, right? Unless you're doing modeling against outcomes. And I've in the past, I've seen it treated as sort of like this, it's just like linear, we invest a ton of money here, we just assume it works, we need it for the reach, but it doesn't get held to the same sort of like, it's not held accountable to the KPIs because it can't be measured. So it's just like, well, we're just gonna assume it works and we're gonna measure everything else. Have you seen that when you talk to brands that are kind of like coming over from linear? I don't know if that's
yes, definitely. And to your point, Sarah, I do think there is sometimes this sense of heightened expectation, perhaps deservedly so on the digital side, right? Oh, you can measure everything in digital, you can see everything. And with linear, there's maybe just kind of this tacit or explicit agreement over the last couple of decades, like, well, that's the best we can do, is we're kind of estimating things. But with connected TV, you can measure everything. And generally, we do feel that's true. We have a lot better visibility and tech to be able to tie either deterministically or probabilistically from a media exposure to some sort of outcome event. One of the things that we've been able to do, and we really like to do because we generally feel it puts us on strong footing, is we can leverage our Inscape ACR data to put a little more, or in some cases a lot more, measurability around linear TV, even though we do not transact on linear TV spots. We see everything that comes through our glass. So in many cases, that gives us the opportunity to show how linear TV spots might perform in driving, for instance, site conversion versus Vizio ads originating spots, and not to totally make it a party where we're trying to dump on linear TV. We can often show that there's this great cliched 1 + 1 = 3 effect, where we can take linear exposure that we're seeing organically from the brand or historically from the brand, opportunistically avoid or retarget based off of that exposure with our ads, and then show a heightened outcome because of that combined exposure or more effective frequency, perhaps.
Yeah, a couple of great threads there. I want to rewind to Sarah's point about just the assuming it works mentality for linear, which I have seen as well. So I fully agree with you, Sarah. It seems linear has kind of gotten away with not being held to the same measurement standards that digital and CTV has, though I do see that changing a bit. So curious, Daniel, for your take on the conversation, having been at digital platforms that have maybe sold against linear budgets or taken from them. Yeah. Do you see it getting better on the just assume it works factor for linear, or do you think that's just the way things will be and there's no really way to change that attitude?
No, it's a great question. I mean, so much of it comes down to sort of like it's historically was totally different people that bought linear and bought digital, and so it's like people weren't even in the same room having the same conversation. And when we were talking about proxies earlier, I was thinking about just GRPs, right, and how the value of a GRP has changed over time. And so I think what's actually happening from where I sit is I think the sort of TV side, the linear side, is being forced to grapple with, the audiences have fragmented a lot. And so even if they're still just buying TV, they have to buy TV in a different way to get to the same effective reach that they did, especially like 40 years ago when you could buy, one show and get a ton of reach, and now you have to buy like 20. So that, I think that has sort of pushed the measurement side on the TV side. And of course, you see a lot of the noise that's being made in the industry now about kind of Nielsen's ability to keep up with that fragmentation and whether it's actually generating that measurement that informs the smart buying. So, I think that's sort of one trend. The other trend that we saw from the Facebook side in particular was when we started to launch video, right? I think this is kind of what Devin was touching on. And sort of the first instinct was like, take my 30-second TV spot and put it in this new context because that's the asset I have. And of course, that doesn't work so well. And then there's a tendency to sort of conflate the bad execution with what the channel can deliver. But in this case, I think the industry was pretty nimble and kind of figured things out pretty quickly. And started to cut videos and then started to figure out the branding and the message really needs to be upfront because the video duration isn't going to be as long. And then when Reels was introduced, that transition was even faster. So I think the industry is getting a little better at understanding that these new consumer experiences require kind of different formats. And what we come back to now is like this challenge of comparing them. And this comes up a lot in discussions around attention. It's like, how do I compare a unit of attention on a linear TV spot to a unit of attention on TikTok or something like that? And all we can do from the measurement perspective, I think, is try to be as consistent as possible and trying to measure the same concepts in those places, and provide a consistent measurement of those concepts. And then again, it goes back to this idea of the value is not constant. It depends on price. It depends on your execution. And so I think the biggest challenge we're facing from the measurement side is how do we provide marketers with that direct comparability. And I don't think the prospects are that great. I think we can measure things really consistently, but this is where the real work comes brand by brand, where they have to turn that on, measure it consistently, connect it to their outcomes, and establish that for their own context and their own use cases. There is just no kind of one metric that's going to provide that. So I know I rambled for a while, I'll stop, but
No,
I think it's super interesting when you sort of look back at the history of media measurement, start with linear TV and the problems that they have to face just in that context. And then it sort of opens up this whole set of questions that we're facing across all the channels.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's good reminder that a lot of the challenges we face now actually are rooted in the way people bought linear TV maybe three plus decades ago. And I also want to rewind to something Devin mentioned around you gave the Inscape ACR data as an example of proprietary data that a media platform can use in measurement. So I'd love to hear more on that, specifically about how Vizio thinks about leveraging proprietary data for measurement, and then any comments from any panelist on examples you've seen across the ecosystem of other media platforms leveraging proprietary data for measurement. So how do you think, Devin, of looking at your measurement framework and saying, obviously there's some metrics we have to get from third parties, but some metrics we have internally. You mentioned view through is one, or sorry, tune in is one. So you can measure tune in yourself. Are there other examples of using your proprietary data to build your own metrics that may not be possible to get from third parties?
So yes, and at the same time, I think we like to, in some ways, have our cake and eat it too. And I'll unpack that a little bit. First, within Vizio ads ecosystem, we have extremely high confidence in the fidelity and granularity of all the signals data that we get. That, of course, starts with opted-in, user-controlled sharing of that information. As a legacy consumer electronics brand, our consumers, not just privacy, but their utility of the platform is first and foremost in our mind with anything we do, because without that audience, we don't have a platform. But so we have a high degree of confidence in all of the great data we get through Inscape ACR data, automatic content recognition, to tell us what's on the glass, as well as user behavior data as they move through our operating system. And we do use that to derive unique insights, whether that is audience outcomes or audience measurement, as you alluded to earlier, Chris, or outcomes like tune in. At the same time, I think one of the things we've been touching on throughout the panel is this idea of standardization, and our Inscape leadership team has a strong view towards, in some ways, really not necessarily picking a winner so much as helping to power a lot of the leading currency contenders and measurement contenders in the space. So we license our Inscape data out to a variety of partners to help inform how they go about measuring. And in doing so, we hope to, you know, say altruistically improve the level of insight and knowledge around the industry and the ecosystem. Selfishly, it helps Inscape and Visio stay centrally located in a lot of those conversations, and allows us to kind of triangulate closer to what we expect the industry outcomes and the industry measurements going to look like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think makes sense to start with the proprietary data you have and then think of all the value you can get from that, whether it's using it directly for campaign measurement or, like you said, giving it to a third party who then can create metrics that still add value to the ecosystem and also to you. That's really interesting. So I wanted to jump to a question thinking outside of a single campaign, and reminder for our audience, if you want to use the Q&A function, we'll try to get to any questions at the end, time permitting. But I know a lot of this conversation has been about measurement within a campaign. We talked about how do you steward a campaign using even some delivery proxies that we think have proven drive towards outcomes when it's a scenario of an outcome not being directly measurable, but that's all a campaign-centric viewpoint. So we'd love any thoughts on how have you seen advertisers or how you yourself have thought of looking at relationship between different types of outcomes across campaigns. So have you proven that there's a causal relationship between a top of funnel outcome on a campaign meant to build awareness, and then another campaign the next month meant to drive footfall, and then another campaign has creative meant to drive a sale and a lower funnel outcome? So we'd love any comments on that from anyone who has perspectives or anecdotes there of how we should think about, can we prove that there's a causal relationship between top of funnel, mid funnel, lower funnel outcomes, even if it's across campaigns? I know it might not be feasible for one campaign to introduce a new brand and drive footfall and drive sales.
I think, Chris, that we've actually been working on just that. I remember I've been in media marketing like 20 plus years in measurement. And so I've seen it all from, when we couldn't measure anything to then we've influx of data. But like the common question I've gotten from clients over the years is always, well, first when there's a particular brand who's historically done a lot of investment in performance media and they're measuring to sales outcome and ROI or cost per customer acquisition. And then they know, particularly for rising brands, right? When they're nascent and they start in that arena, and then they hit a point where they're like, okay, we know we need to start doing branding, but we really want to be able to measure that to sales. Or we know in theory that we need to lift awareness among new audiences for our product, but like, how is that? We don't want to just have a lift in awareness for the sake of it. We want to prove that drives sales. And I had for years and years never been able to really do that, but it's something we're working on now. I don't think I could use the word causal. Causal is very tough, right? But in terms of correlation, like we've seen, because we're running, we and shamelessly plug Upwave. We partner with Upwave, and we run, for any of our clients that are running, where we're doing brand campaigns, and we're measuring an attitudinal KPI. So we have done many of these studies across different clients and categories, and so now we have like a database of results we can pull. We found a really strong relationship between like unique on target impressions in a campaign and then the lift in the attitudinal KPI. And then we were able to find a really strong relationship between the lift in awareness or consideration or whatever the attitudinal KPI is for that campaign and sales. So it's kind of it's modeled. And again, it's like, it's not, I don't think we can say causal, it's correlation.
Yeah,
it's really, it's interesting, and it's something, it's like more than I've ever seen in my career.
That's interesting. Daniel or Devin, any thoughts on work you've done across an individual campaign to look for even a relationship between different metrics?
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
No, please, Devin, go.
I feel like I just did a big monologue not so long ago, so I'd love to defer to you on this one.
All right, I'll do. Sorry, well, I already talked about sort of the things we're doing to sort of establish long-term correlations. I think that's super important. But I completely agree with Sarah. Like causality is a high bar. And there you do need experiments. Like that's really the only way you can do it. And we did quite a bit of this at Meta, where we had lots of well-run controlled experiments and we measured outcomes and brand outcomes. And there's cases where we could see a relationship. There's cases where we couldn't. And I mean, this is where I think a theory of advertising, how advertising works, is super important, right? Because like you can take very kind of obvious statements like if you've never heard of a brand or a product, then you're not going to know to go buy it. And when you see it, you might not know what it is. So there's some baseline level of awareness and knowledge you need. And so if you're measuring that attitudinally and you're increasing that with your campaign, then by definition, you're increasing the probability of affecting an outcome down the line. And what we see is like doing this really depends on the sort of considerate, like how high a consideration product is it, and then what's the distance between purchases. And so you can take the two extremes, like a toothpaste, where of course like you want to be always on, and be unaided recall is a really good proxy for conversions, whereas if you take like a BMW campaign where someone might consider buying that once in their lives, it's going to be almost impossible to establish any causality between the two. But your theory would say, well, at least they better have some positive associations with this brand and know what it stands for if I'm going to have any chance during that small window when they care. So I think again, like it's nice to talk about a particular exercise and correlating a KPI with an outcome, but it has to be part of this, like what is the brand, what is the product, how can you reasonably expect to impact a purchase? And getting down to that, whether an ad can do that is of course really hard.
And I would just say too, Chris, like I think if you think about what we're trying to do with measuring the impact of advertising, I've been saying this a lot, it's been my soapbox. We're trying to put a message in front of a particular set of people and then measure how it's changing their mind or their heart or their behavior, right? Whether that behavior is like a website visitor going to a store and purchasing something. It's actually not something you can really prove. Like I've been trying to talk about like the word accuracy is really misplaced when we talk about measuring advertising. It's all signals at the end of the day. It's the best we can do is to try to like use signals that we are able to detect to measure the hearts and minds and behaviors of people. So sort of a little philosophical rant.
I like that. That belongs on a t-shirt. We're here to change hearts, minds, and behaviors. That's great. And Devin, I was going to have you chime in on how media platforms and publishers think about this in terms of what's really fair to ask of someone who sells media from an outcome. There's a lot of talk about publisher guarantees, platform guarantees, and I think sometimes that's reasonable. Sometimes it's unreasonable. If you give a very poor creative to a media platform, you may not be able to ask them to guarantee to get a certain outcome if the creative is simply not going to perform. So how do you think about that? Or how do you think other media platforms think about that? What's fair to expect of publishers from a guarantee standpoint, or just all these asks we're putting on them to drive outcomes with the media we buy from them?
Well, I think Sarah mentioned this earlier, not to make it sound too high-handed, but as stewards of our clients' budgets, who, we're trying to accomplish the goals they're looking to accomplish, there is a level of deference that I think we need to and want to pay to how they approach us. And we'll always provide our recommendations, but we want to put ourselves in the position to compete for and earn their not just first-time business, but repeat business. One of the things that Daniel mentioned that resonated really well with me, and we're not always so lucky to have this or fortunate, but the willingness to experiment, I think, is really predicated on a relationship that ideally spans more than one campaign or RFP cycle, right? I think it's trust that's earned over time with the relationship and proven track record, but also willingness of a client or agency team to work with you on how you define and then redefine and continually redefine success. And the challenge we sometimes run into is we have a client who might look at multiple facets of measurement and tell us, you know, they're all going to be important equally, or we're just looking at this one, it's not that important. And then ultimately they have to make a tough decision on budgets and say, oh, this one that we didn't think was going to matter actually was the most important one and is the trump card. So the opposite of that is where we can establish a relationship where we can not just say, here's one number that confirms whether we succeeded or failed, but say, here's the body of evidence, as Sarah mentioned, that's not necessarily proving causation, but there's some suggestion of correlation that, we moved an audience from this point in the funnel down to here. Here's where they dropped off. So here's the tactical differences we can make in the next campaign to keep them moving down the line. That is like our ideal situation, is where we can leverage multiple different data sets and have an informed conversation to tweak and optimize, rather than it be this doomsday conversation where it's, kind of do or die.
Yeah, I like that. I think it is about an informed conversation to optimize. So I'll use that as a segue. Thank you for closing with that. That was what I wanted to ask about next, was optimization. So wanted to shift from a measurement conversation around establishing what metrics were hit, and a lot of this comes back from a classic measurement report card standpoint, to an optimization, which I think is more important. And that's how we actually change the campaign while it's running to get the more of the outcome we want. So we'll love any perspectives there. And Daniel, I'll start with you, because I know you think a lot about optimization, not just measurement. So what are some latest wins you've seen in the ecosystem there, either from with your clients or elsewhere, of how the industry is not just thinking of static report cards that we look at mid or end of campaign, but think of actually changing the media while it's running to optimize to specific outcomes?
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, in some ways it's not new at all, especially during my time at Facebook, right? We were building optimizations to outcomes for years and years. What is changing is that, and it's changing for Facebook and for everyone, that, the signal that we rely on for informing those optimizations is fragmenting and isn't available in all places at all times. So, I think there's sort of always two pieces to it that I think about. One is the quality of that signal, how much of, how rich is it, how much does it really inform kind of the decisioning that you're going to do, and then how sophisticated is the mechanism you have for ingesting that and making decisions, right? And so this is where obviously machine learning and now AI are playing increasingly important roles. At DV, we're very focused on trying to figure out what signal we have and where and how it will be useful to marketers, and providing a mechanism to do that. But I think this is one of the kind of key areas that it's going to be a sort of an arms race, or everyone is kind of going to be continually searching for a signal to the extent they can get it. And I think this idea of sort of making it easy for marketers to bring the data that they need for their purposes to bear is really important. So whether it's under the guise of bring your own data, or clean rooms, or data marketplaces, or something, like all of these, I think are going to be increasingly important. And then the question is going to be, how do we start to measure and value the different data sources for a specific context? Because people are going to want to put price tags on those signals.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, we'll circle back to that. You get the prize for hitting AI on your bingo card first. So we'll follow up with some.
I was trying to put it off as long as possible.
Very good. Well, we have to. We
Because
will.
I have no idea what it means, but
we will circle back. I'm curious for everyone's take on that. But Sarah, I'll turn to you next in terms of the optimization question. Have you seen a change in terms of how advertisers, or maybe certain types of advertisers, have expectations for you and your team to optimize? I imagine a traditional direct response advertiser, since the birth of digital, was always optimizing to clicks or conversions. But I also would imagine maybe brand advertisers have higher expectations now of in-flight optimization. How has that changed?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, algorithmic optimization it can be a little bit, it can be dangerous. Like dangerous sounds weird. So not dangerous. But it can be, you can end up optimizing to noise, right? And so it's exactly, you started with where I was going to start, traditional direct response advertisers who are just trying to sell whatever they're selling and get the lowest CPA. And like we've worked with that, and that's great. And that's a good objective to have. And it's clear. And if you have a clear signal that you know our sales and you can optimize to that or to, the lowest CPA, awesome. There's like no issue there. But I think it's when you get into the proxy world that you start to have trouble, or you get into like, well, we're really trying to drive an outcome with a specific audience. I've seen it happen where in like DSPs and like so programmatically traded media and social, where you have to set an optimization KPI, but it isn't your campaign's primary objective because that data is not available. So we're using a proxy, and then we optimize ourselves out of the audience we're trying to reach, right? Because the platform's algorithm is like just trying to find users who are doing the thing, whether it's like a site visit or whatever else it is. So yeah, I think it's a real balancing act. And this conversation started with like, how do we think about optimization different than like outcome measurement? And for me, they're the same. Like we want to be able to optimize to the primary objective and KPI of our campaign, which is ideally an outcome. So I always try to line those things up, because when if you're saying like we have a campaign where we're really trying to drive a lift in awareness, but we're optimizing to site visits, and then we have reports that show a lift in site visits, but no lift in awareness, like where does that leave you, right? It's like you're just swirling. So yeah, I think it's a huge balancing act, and depending on the campaign and the objectives of it and how important it is to stay within target audience and what data is available is sort of what drives the approach.
Yeah, I love that. I love the point about noise. And I laugh at the point around saying your campaign has metric A as its goal, but you're optimizing metric B. We actually, quick plug for us, we published an op-ed recently titled "Here's Why Optimizing to Clicks is Not Optimizing at All." So if the audience Googles,
oh my God, 100%. It's like less than 1% of people click on ads. So like,
don't say you have a outcome goal, but then that's how you actually optimize the media. So yeah, we fully agree. So Devin, curious if you have any thoughts on this. I imagine optimization is part of your pitch to advertisers, not just running media and seeing what metrics show up. So what's been the latest in those conversations of what's kind of effective and not just noise, as Sarah said, with in-flight optimization?
What's interesting to me is some of the most concrete and, to me, exciting outcomes that we as an industry can demonstrate often have the longest lag times. And that's where everything Daniel and Sarah have already, spoken a bit about on identifying proxies, or what's the thing that we can optimize towards in the meantime, in some cases becomes the best we can do. But the other thing I'll put a plug in for, in a little bit of self-interest, is the importance not just of having some level of machine learning based or AI based ability to optimize more on the fly, but the ability to go deep on a set of data and really try to understand beyond the surface level, why are we seeing the things we're seeing, and maybe some of these proxy data points that could help us inform a more strategic approach to optimizing. One that comes to mind is, and this is maybe mixing, outcomes and marketing strategies a little bit, but we've seen this many times, is we might be working with a retailer or a QSR to drive store visits, but they really want to drive store visits against a new audience. So they want to hit a new audience and get new visitors to their QSR, their retail. And the campaign will start to get data. And what we'll see is, if we want to just win this campaign by the metrics that the client is measuring, what we found is we should just run against a heavy loyalist audience, even taking into account, stripping back behavioral preconceptions of that audience. That's how we're going to win that metric. But that's not really in line with what their RFP and their stated goal were of reaching new audiences. So sometimes I think it even involves optimizing against maybe our own self-interest, but being able to have that conversation with the client to say, look, we've actually demonstrated we can really reach and influence a new audience. If you're just going to grade us on this metric, here's what we would probably recommend. but don't you think this is closer to what you actually want to be doing? And that's where it comes back to that trust and established relationship to get that buy-in to say, oh yeah, that's actually, thank you for bringing that up. That's a better outcome for us.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So we're almost out of time. So I'll do a quick pivot just to make sure I get in the distinct question about AI. I'd be remiss to moderate a panel in 2023 and not have a specific standalone question about AI. So Daniel touched on some of this about the kind of race for signal to power AI models. So curious if people have thoughts on what else, if anything, AI will mean to outcome measurement. Is it just about using machine learning models to reallocate media, which has been around for a while but is improving? Or is it about other things, capturing new data, measuring things we can't currently measure, doing complex analyses we can't currently do? How should our audience think of what AI will bring, in addition to kind of optimizing campaigns with machine learning models?
I'll try to be brief. I know it's difficult for me. I'll one plus one, the optimization. I'm also really curious to see what kind of role AI can take in dynamic creative optimization. I think there's a level of caution we have to apply there when we're putting a brand identified logo or spot in front of a consumer based on something AI has created. But on the consumer electronics side of the house, we're always looking for ways to improve our content recommendation engines. And in some ways, our advertising, recommendation or advertising creative follows on from that. We want all of our ad experiences to feel like value additive and organic for our audience. So there's potentially a future where AI and machine learning can help us do that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think right now AI is very nascent and we have to be very careful. And again, it's like there's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of noise. But what AI can do, machine learning is probably the most far along right now. And what AI is really good at right now is automating manual tasks. And back to what you said earlier, Daniel, what's old is new again. MMM, like I've always been such a huge fan of MMM for measurement. But the challenge with it is that it takes, 3 months. It takes a bunch of statisticians to like hand build models and do transformations to fit the data, and brands can afford to do it like twice a year at most. And so then it's just not timely. But now with machine learning, a lot of that can be automated, and we've been working on something internal. So we're sort of building a proprietary solution to use machine learning to do MMM as fast as weekly. So I think applications like that, and there's a lot of them in our industry, from like trafficking ads to, analyzing big sets of data to just, doing some, manual pieces of analytics, AI can help a lot with.
Yeah. That's well said. I mean, I think it is, the potential is in automating and maybe ingesting more signal than obviously manual processes or even machine learning can do. But it doesn't get us out of the fundamental problem. Like, you still need to know if it worked, right? It's still, whether it was an agency doing it in the past or now is an AI doing it, like the question is, did it work? And so we still need to know kind of what the outcome was and whether it achieved it and at what cost. And so I think it's going to still be incumbent on us to focus on those things and seeing how we can connect whatever decisions it ends up making to the outcomes.
Yeah. A great way to close. We are unfortunately out of time. I could ask you guys questions for the rest of the day, but I know everyone has other things to get to, and our audience probably needs to hop after an hour. But what a wonderful hour. A lot of great topics. I know a lot of great takeaways for everyone who showed up. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Devin. I loved having you guys on. And thanks to our audience for listening. We will talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.